unpacking abstract nouns and putting the participants back into the process of government. Because government is an abstract noun, a word ending with M-E-N-T, or a word ending with I-O-N. It isn't talked about like it's a noun, but really it's a process. And we can understand it, talk about it, and write about it by unpacking that process, putting the participants back into the process by asking the question, who's doing what? In government, legislation, constitution, regulation. Because the big question to ask about governments making laws is not how they make them or the reason why they make them, but the reason why people obey them. Because the clash between Aboriginal customary law and English law, Australian law in Australia, is devastating evidence of what happens when the legitimacy of the law is in question. Because Australia began as a constitutional monarchy, and it still is, and we're drawing on two institutions, democratic elections, but at the same time a constitutional monarchy which draws on the concept of the divine right of kings given by God to hand out laws to the people. And what these two traditions have in common is the idea that the law is legitimate and that you should obey it. Either because God gave the right to the king and that's how things have always been, or because you chose it. And once we see that, we see why it's so important for people to be engaged in the process of democracy, why the government wants it in the curriculum, because we need to believe that we are choosing our government so that we obey the laws, so we comply with regulations. Because it's not simply a matter of saying people obey the law because otherwise they'll be punished, because if that was the case, we'd have a society full of people being punished, of incredibly high incarceration rates. We'd have a police state, people questioning the authority of the right of the government to rule, and the government would be relying on violence and coercive control to get people to behave, and that's simply not the case most of the time. So if we unpack the process of legislation, it's a TION word, which means it's a process, which means who's doing what. So we're talking about democratically elected representatives, members of the lower house of parliament, typically a minister, presenting a bill which is then debated. And when it passes the lower house, it goes to the upper house, where the upper house then debates it and sends it back. And all the people involved in this process are there because they've been elected in a democratic election process, which is all there to, certainly functions to legitimize their authority, but to make those decisions which leads to citizens respecting them and complying with them. Because once the bill becomes an act of parliament, it then receives the assent of the Governor-General, who as the head of state is the representative of the king, and therefore drawing on all those traditions that go back as far as Hammurabi, that the God-given right, divine right of kings to rule makes laws legitimate, and that's how they come to be recognised and accepted by people within the state. But then, of course, the letter of the law needs to be implemented in the real world, and that's where we get to regulations, and why my car says to me, please obey all traffic regulations, because in the end the law becomes, this is a 40 zone, you need to have a driver's license. These are the things that you need to do. These regulations are what you need to do to comply with the law. But when it comes to implementing those regulations, there's another process at play called the courts, where other participants in the process, lawyers and judges, tribunals, layers of court need to interpret the law and decide what the letter of the law applies to this situation, and where there isn't a law created by the legislative power of the House of Representatives, aka statute law. We fall back on common law, which is based on precedent, which simply asks the question not just who's doing what, but who did what in the past. What decisions were made about situations that arose in the past? Or do we need, in fact, to create a new common law in this situation to apply to it? But again, the critical question is not so much how laws are made, why do people accept them, and how does that process of legitimating the law, of accepting the law, of complying with the law, help us to understand why they are made in the way that they are, and how much history we are drawing on to get us there. That's unpacking abstract nouns and putting the participants back into the process of government.